I'm Georgie.
And I'm VG.
Welcome to our podcast, Diversity and Inclusion Satisfying Tickbox.
In today's episode, we'll be covering Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD.
So today we actually have a special guest joining us, Kieran Blay, who will be sharing his journey and experiences with ADHD. So Kieran, if you could just do a quick intro just to let everyone know who you are, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on. It's exciting to be here and discuss this topic, especially with the amount of focus that ADHD and neurodiversity as a whole has had in recent, I'd say the last kind of couple of years really, but certainly ramped up in the recent months. So yeah, excited to be here. Really, journey comes back to, as we'll discuss today, a journey comes back to being diagnosed kind of at 5 years old, 26 years ago, feeling a little bit old now, being the wrong side of 30. But yeah, happy to look forward to kind of deep diving on the various avenues that it's taken me down.
Thank you, Kieran, and it's a pleasure having you here. What I wanted to get from you, Kieran, is I think it'd be good for you to describe it in your own words what ADHD is.
Yeah, I think lots of people have a different view depending on their own experiences, but essentially, as you've introduced it, really is it's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Lots of people see it as to kind of a few different ways, and it expresses itself in different ways with different people. I don't pigeonhole it at all, but you see quite common stories where, say, females get diagnosed later in life because it expressed itself in a different manner when they were children. So you tend to find sometimes that people are more withdrawn as opposed to what people would expect with them being kind of out and loud about it. And being more disruptive, they are a little bit more withdrawn. So we're finding more and more people now getting diagnosed later in life, 20s, 30s, 40s, and some stories I've heard from friends and colleagues is even into the 50s and beyond. The interesting thing with ADHD is just because you were diagnosed a little bit later didn't mean that you've only just got it or experienced it in recent years. It's actually more often than not, it's genetic, so it's passed down through our family line from our parents and so on. So if you're diagnosed later on in life, it's quite an interesting kind of story and journey to unravel because you've had that since birth. So why has it taken till then to be diagnosed? And that's why I say it expresses itself in different people, and different people have different traits, strengths and weaknesses. And that's kind of, I guess, from my own experience and opinion as to why people may not get diagnosed till later in life.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's quite like a spectrum, isn't it? I think there's not really one way of defining ADHD. I'm quite interested. Do you have anyone else in your family with ADHD? Or has been
It's a great
diagnosed?
question. It's a great question. Ultimately, yes, because it's genetic, right?
Yeah.
So, I well, it's a bit of a story with this one. So back in 2018, I left Formula One and came into the world of business, and I started in startups. And I was working for a neuroscience startup, kind of on the outskirts of London towards Essex, called Smart Start Minds. We used to run evening workshops for parents and professionals and just people interested in learning more about ADHD and neurodiversity, and back then talking about a lot about ADD as well, and dyslexia and things. But we did one particular event where it was just after I joined, and they asked if I'd be interested in presenting my story to share with parents, as to help them understand what their children might be going through and experiencing, and how they might be able to support that, and how my mum supported me and how my family supported me growing up. And it wasn't until the neuroscientist that was presenting kind of that this is a genetically inherited disorder in some ways. I hate using that word as well, actually. I think in my life, as much as it's ups and downs, I like to think it's a bit of a superpower. But he said he shared with the room that this was a thing that was more or less, more often than not, inherited genetically. And my mum had come down to watch and just kind of see me in action, if you like. And I think it came out there and then that my mum realised that she was the one that passed it on. So we often have discussions about it now, and I hope she most doesn't mind me saying on Spotify and wherever else we publish this. But yeah, I think I think that the link is between my mum and I.
Okay, that's so interesting. So was she diagnosed, or was it kind of she was a
Uh,
late diagnosis, or
no, I've been nudging her to try and look
oh,
and
okay,
but so far it's been fairly unsuccessful conversation.
yeah,
And I think, and that's actually another interesting point is that when you are later in life, like my mum's in her mid 50s, is there any, like, there's some of them are thinking, is there any point? I've gone this far. Actually, not a million miles away from retirement. So how is a diagnosis going to help me? And what am I going to achieve through support now? And so they think, oh, just go on as life as usual. It's nice to just have a little bit more awareness that this might be a thing. Some of the challenges and some of the gifts that are associated with it, and just self-learning and go and just continue going on the path that they already had done, just more aware of the condition itself. But not,
yeah. I think that's a good point because I was diagnosed with dyslexia quite late as well, and part of me was thinking, oh, should I do this or not because it might change how I don't know how I perceive things or things like that. But it's actually been really helpful for me to understand how I work and how I kind of tackle things a bit more. But just conscious of your story, taking it back to the start, do you want to give a bit of background on kind of what it was like growing up as a kid and your experiences in school?
yeah, of course. So I was diagnosed as early as you possibly could be when I was a child. I was diagnosed at the age of 5. I believe, and some people may put in comments after this that it's different now, but I believe it's still 5 years old when you
Mm-hmm.
at the earliest diagnosis. See a few people earlier with autism, but I think with ADHD it might still be 5. Back when I got diagnosed, that was certainly the case. But my mum describes my childhood because once I never really discussed my ADHD until I was however old I was in 2018. So I'm getting so old that I'm forgetting dates and timelines. But in 2000, before 2018, didn't really tell anyone. Obviously, people at school knew, and then as I got into the world of work, I just kept it. I kept my mouth shut. Some people thought that there were obvious traits for some fairly obvious reasons at the time. But and then obviously my family knew, but I hadn't really told anyone. So it's only really been the last few years where I've been kind of out and talking about it. And then the reason why that's important is because then my family were then more open with me around talking about the earlier parts of the journey. So when I was young, my mum was a single mum fairly early on in my life, around the age of 1. And so she just thought that she had a fun, happy baby, is what she's always described it as. And she never really realized that there was anything necessarily different in any way. And it wasn't until I then went to preschool, into nursery, where then that kind of those differentiating factors between me and other children became more apparent. I just had a lot more energy than other children. I was quite disruptive. I was quite I'd like to be the center of attention when I was a kid. Some might tell you I quite like that now, but I'd like to think I've tampered that down a bit. But that was certainly the case when I was younger, and I used to do silly, impulsive things, even as a toddler. So my mum tells me of a story where I was at Little People's Playgroup in Hook in Hampshire. We were doing arts and crafts, and we had those rubbish plastic scissors that we all remember as kids that never really managed to cut anything. And one of the helpers leant over me to help with something, not sure what it was. And I started trying to cut her hair with the scissors, which apparently didn't go down very well at all. So
No.
luckily I can't remember that. I'm sure there's probably some trauma there in my brain deep down. But I used to do silly, impulsive things like that when I was a kid. And that became a bit of a theme, really. And that is a major trait of ADHD is impulsivity, impulsivity and impulsivity control. There's been some times where I've bought a car randomly. I've gone out looking for a car for someone else and come back with one for me and nothing for them. Or more recently, when on my birthday this year, I I took a friend's car for an MOT whilst they were away. And whilst I was there, I walked into the garage next door because the MOT centre was in the middle of nowhere. So I hung around while they were doing it, and I saw a Audi TT in there and it was happened to be the one that I was kind of looking at and had been after for a little while. It was my birthday in 2 days' time, and I just thought impulsively justified to myself that to me from me, and took it out for a test drive. And within an hour, I'd bought it and traded mine in, which I'd only had for about a year and a half. So I do silly things. I'm still fairly impulsive on certain things like that. But things that are fun as opposed to things that create negative impact, I'd like to think. But my journey through school, just coming back to that earlier stage, those earlier stages, I found it really easy to make friends, if I'm completely honest, because I was the forward one. I was always quite confident in speaking to people. Some people actually with ADHD, or those that in later life found a bit more about autism, which will come on, I'm sure we'll probably come on to a bit later. But well, as a kid, I didn't know that side. So to me, it was just ADHD. But I found making friends, kind of networking in the corporate life back then as a child, quite easy. But I lost friends just as fast. That was quite hard because I always just thought that people 1 minute liked me and then the next minute didn't, or I was spoken about in groups aside to the ones that I was being included in, or I'd get slightly bullied for doing silly little things that I didn't realize that were different or that I shouldn't be doing. And then I'd also get into fights quite a lot, physical fights at school, which obviously isn't a good thing. But yeah, when I was younger, I used to be, especially with that kind of that hyperactivity side of ADHD. I did have aggressive bursts, which I'm not overly proud of, but unfortunately, in being open and honest about it, were there at the time. And one thing that I found that was kind of a mediator for me was sport. So I've always been involved in sport. Then later in life, I was when I went to my early parts of my career in motorsport, those kind of rush of things and a lot of energy and wearing myself out actually then allowed me to kind of more moderate myself. My brain was a lot clearer. Kind of that foggy side wasn't there. The impulsivities were less. And overall, it was just just a little bit easier to get along in life. But sport and my career have always been those mediators for me. And moving through from kind of childhood into teenage years, it's I don't know really how to put it, to be honest. I think it was the same trends as when I was a child. Good at networking, good easily make friends. I was always really curious about other people. I find other people fascinating. And then all of a sudden, people wouldn't want to be around me or associated to me. And I wouldn't get invited to parties, like kids' parties and stuff. Like, remember when you were a kid and got invited to someone's 6th birthday party and everyone's there like jelly ice cream, all the rest of it. One, I was told by the psychiatrists in my care plan for ADHD that I wasn't supposed to have any of those like E-number related foods or blue Smarties, as everyone was banning around back when we were children. But wouldn't get invited to those parties, which was obviously at the time I didn't really understand why. But looking back on it now, I can understand it. Still don't like it, but I can understand it. And then going into my teens, I learned a little bit more about myself. So I was able to channel the energy that would otherwise cause impulsivity and other things into things that I really enjoyed. And I became aware quite early on of how to manage, how to get more out of myself, how to get the best out of myself in a way, which was focusing on the things that I enjoy and that I'm good at, and just realizing on the things that the negative traits of ADHD, or my experience of negative traits with ADHD cause, just leave them to one side and don't get upset by that. It's just that you're good at some things, you're not good at others, and that's absolutely fine. I think we try and find too many people these days trying to be good at everything. So for me, that was as I said before, it was my career and sport, and that was really that kind of journey and trend through my childhood.
Thank you for sharing that, Kieran. That was quite emotional, but also deep in terms of what you went through. So thank you. I wanted to, and I quote, this is the words you used, you mentioned challenges and gifts associated with ADHD. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit so that the listeners can understand as well?
Yeah, sure. So everybody, as I said before, everybody's got a different experience with ADHD, and it's not just ADHD. Everyone has a different experience with whatever it is that they may have, whether that's ADHD, dyspraxia, autism. Obviously, there are some key traits that are more commonly found, but everybody still has a slightly different experience. So what I'll share now isn't necessarily what another five people you'd speak to with ADHD might experience, but so in terms of challenges, for me, early on, as I was saying before, was really around that impulsivity control. And as I was younger, emotional regulation was also difficult. I'd get upset really quickly. I'd get angry really quickly. Equally, I'd get happy really quickly. All those different emotions were almost like instantaneous, like switch triggers type thing. So it was like on-off switch. One minute I'd be really happy, and then it would just for some random reason, and it could be super, super small, really superficial to most people, just send me to the other side of the chart. That was quite a steep and difficult learning curve through life, getting through that bit. But impulsivity, emotional control, speed of thinking. Now, this hovers on a bit of a line for me because it's also one of the, in inverted commas, superpowers that I've got is that I feel that sometimes I am 20 steps, 20 thoughts ahead into a problem, whilst maybe the rest of the group is still kind of on step 3 and 4. And I find that, and I still kind of find that sometimes super frustrating. So I'm like, well, we could have got to this earlier, but we're not there yet. And I think that's part of being an adult, is you understand that everybody's a bit different, and we need to, and that's kind of the art of diverse teams, is that we are all a little bit different, but collectively we create innovative things and do better work together. The speed of thinking was a bit of a challenge because that led to impulsive decisions that maybe weren't so positive when I was growing up. So it's doing a lot of learning with that, of turning that from a challenge into something that I can funnel into something that's more positively used and positively impactful now. Some other things that for some of the listeners may have seen recently over the last year or so, some publications coming out from Monzo Bank around financial, I don't know which way to put it, to be honest, financial stability, knowledge, use. Can't really think of the right word to use, but because of that impulsivity side and the emotional regulation, Monzo actually found that there's links to ADHD and a higher cost of living in a way. And so people with ADHD tend to spend, I think it was something like £1,600 more on average a year, because they buy things impulsively. I saw there's a couple of ADHD influencers on LinkedIn that had been posting around this recently, saying that they just buy random books and like gifts for people or stuff for themselves that they never actually end up using half the time because it's novel. And that's the thing with ADHD, is the novel thing always gets your attention, and it's always at the top of your priority list. And I'd say that then probably leads on to the next challenge and now trait. Is the most novel thing at the time. It takes precedent. So it's kind of like I liken it to a puppy. New shiny things, new toys, new whatever it might be. And it's like that's where their attention is, and they're over there sniffing all over there with the new toy. And that's kind of like, I liken that to ADHD a little bit, is that the fun stuff gets to the top of the priority list, and some of the stuff that might actually be really important to get done first just starts to slide down. And it's not because that's what we want to do, it's just because naturally we're drawn by the nice shiny new thing that we want to tackle. And that may be because there's a challenge associated with that, and we see the challenge as something that we'd like to sink our teeth into. In terms of traits, hyperfocus has always been a good one for me. So I think good for me, bad for some people that I've worked with at times. But certainly on subjects that I enjoyed at school, hyperfocus was great. So I was good at maths as a kid. I enjoyed maths. I hated English. I wasn't very good at RE and geography and a few other bits and pieces. And then I loved history. But those few subjects that I was interested in, I'd hyper focus on. And so when I was, I think it was year 7 or 8, secondary school. I think it was year 8. there was a maths paper, just a modular maths paper that we all had kind of every term, and I think there was two of us in our year group that got 100% on that paper. And hyperfocus allowed me to go on a really deep dive into what was needed to get a good score. I really enjoyed maths. The challenge with that is that it's almost like, the horse in a carriage with blinkers on around its eyes. It's a little bit like that. You can see what's in front of you and what you should be focused on, what's in your line of sight, but then everything outside of that doesn't seem to exist. So I'll give an example of we have kids these days, and I think we were of that generation where we were just coming into it with consoles, PlayStations, Dreamcast, Sega Mega Drive. Did you?
Yep, Sega. That was my first console.
GoldenEye. But when I'd play on a console, really focused on what's going on the screen, and my mum could be to one side, or whoever it might be, trying to distract me to, I don't know, it might be dinner is ready, or whatever it might be, and I just can't hear that. That noise doesn't exist in my head while I'm focused on something. But it also served me really well a little bit later on in life. So when I got to motorsport, see, you've got a lot of responsibility, essentially building a car that someone's going to go to great speeds in. And if a part fails on that car, that is down, obviously, to a certain extent. Obviously, get part failures because of materials and things, but ultimately, people responsible for that are the people that built it and the people that maintain it. So hyperfocus really helped me in being quite OCD in a way, super meticulous with the job at hand. So it helped me in my working career as well. And also, lastly, sport. I find a sport that I enjoy. And so growing up, that was football. And then I went into hockey. More recently, oddly, very left field, ice skating. And I just hyperfocus on it. It is. It's really good, isn't it? It's good fun.
Yeah.
It's like you're doing cardio without realizing you're doing cardio. And everybody hates doing cardio at the gym. So go to the gym through a week, Tuesday evening, ice skating, get almost like my masked cardio in. But I really enjoyed it. And going up through the like level 1, 2, 3, 4, currently on just finished level 6 going into level 7. I just want to get all the little details right to be able to progress. So yeah, those are the traits and challenges I think that are most prominent in my life.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think because there's obviously, you can see the symptoms in a positive way, but also how it can kind of detriment you as well. And I think just going back to the kind of emotional control and things like that, I think medication is quite a big topic, isn't it? It can be quite a controversial topic with medicating children and things like that. So what's your kind of journey with that? Did you take more of a natural remedy route? Because I know you spoke about doing sports quite a lot growing up.
Yeah, so medication is I've not had the greatest journey with it, but just before we come on explain my journey with medication, I think it's worth going a little bit of why some of the emotional control and things are a bit of a challenge for those with ADHD. And it really comes down to, and I'm no scientist, but this is just my understanding of it from some of my own research and talking to people that do specialize in it, is really around the kind of underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So those frontal lobes, that most of our kind of executive control resides within. So our impulsivity control, emotional control, and such like. And you find that the development cycle of that, if you took someone with ADHD and someone neurotypical, I don't want to call them normal, neurotypical people, if you have brain scans of one of each, you'd see that the prefrontal cortex and the brain development of someone with ADHD is just a certain percentage behind the development of someone neurotypical. And the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex of the brain isn't as active, if you like, not flowing as freely and prevalently to the prefrontal cortex as it would be with someone that doesn't have ADHD. So it's kind of where some of that then from a physiological point of view or biological point of view kind of comes from. I'm sure some experts that may listen to this will correct me with some terminology, and that's fine, but that's my understanding of it. And with the medication side though, my journey was not didn't start off great. So I can't remember exactly how old I was, but essentially I went on to Ritalin first, which was a really common medication when I was diagnosed. It may still be now. I've heard of people using Ritalin recently, but it was the most commonly prescribed medicine, if you like, for ADHD when I was a kid. But they put me on a dosage. Can't remember exactly what that was, and I took half a tablet one morning before school, and I almost got expelled from school that day. So it actually sent me the opposite direction. So I took half a tablet, and my emotional control and my emotional control and my impulsivity went through the roof. So the story goes, and I'm not very proud of this one, but the story basically goes that it was actually a friend of mine at the time, but they hung their coat on my peg. You remember when we were at primary school, we all had our own little peg to hang
Yeah,
our.
that's not on. That's not on.
To be honest,
How dare they?
But they hung their coat on my peg, and it was like red rag to a bull. And when they were in the playground a little bit later on, I swung them around by the hood of their coat and threw them across the playground, and it ended up with my mum taking a horrible walk of shame over to their house to apologise to their parents after school. So obviously I was dragged out of class that morning, and my mum rang I think my mum rang the psychiatrist or something. They explained what had happened, and they said, don't let him take any more. So my journey with Ritalin was very short.
What, just out of interest, sorry, what's Ritalin? What's kind of the effect it's meant to have when you take it? Because obviously, if you only took half and it gave you those effects, that's yeah. I want to know what it's like meant to do.
I don't know the ins and outs of it, if I'm completely honest. But I think with any medication, it's just supposed to kind of I think just to mediate the peaks and troughs a little bit more. So for ADHD, a lot of ADHD medication is like caffeine. It's a stimulant. So my brain works at a million miles an hour, 24/7. And so, but it's almost like my body and my brain work at two different rates. And I think the medication just allows kind of one to meet the other. And that's a super simplistic way of going about of talking about it. But my understanding is just to be able to kind of mellow you out in the middle somewhat and just give you a little bit more control over some of the traits that we were discussing earlier that might not be as positive for you as others.
Kieran, and just out of curiosity, did they get the medication wrong or the dosage, or where? Because it seems like they gave you this and they were confident it's going to be a positive outcome, and it hasn't. So where did they go wrong in a way? That's what I want to know.
I think like with anything, with any medication for something, it's a bit trial and error. Now I get on my high horse sometimes about what our knowledge as a society and medically of ADHD back then. So I think you break a bone, you have an X-ray, they can see exactly where the break is, they know how to treat that. If you have other things going, there, have a CT scan or whatever it might be, they can have a look at the injury site, and there is a process into getting you back to full health. If you get diagnosed with ADHD, which back in those days was just like a conversation and possibly a questionnaire, they don't do brain scans, they just give you medication. But as we were saying earlier, not everybody has the same experience with ADHD, with traits and challenges and such like. And so medication therefore won't be and shouldn't be the same in everybody. It's going to be a bit different. It's like some people are allergic to like penicillin, for instance, right? So it's the same thing with there is a bit of trial and error as to finding something that's going to work for that individual. ADHD just really didn't. Ritalin didn't work for my ADHD, and it wasn't until then a few years later when we tried something else. So there was another drug that came over from the US, I believe, originally called Concerta. Now, Georgie, to your point earlier on kind of how does that have an effect with Ritalin, with Concerta, the way it was described to me is it was to slow down my thinking and my action. So that it basically, they likened it to, their example was a game of knuckles. And they said, if we put our hands out and you haven't had this medication, ADHD is basically a really fast, impulsive knock, and you've got no time to move your hand out the way. You're going to lose every time. If you take this medication, it's like the hand is moving slower. You can see that happening, and it gives you an opportunity to move out the way. So essentially, yeah, slowing that thinking, that space between thinking and action down, creating a gap for you to make a choice at the end of the day. They gave me that. I can't remember exactly how long I was on it for. But my mum, a quote from my mum when we did that talk back in 2018 was that she felt she lost a little boy, which was hard to hear in public.
That's heartbreaking.
At the time, even felt in myself, I just felt like a snail. I felt really sluggish, and it just slowed me right down to the point of almost like feeling inactivity. I couldn't function, brain fog, wasn't really interested in some things that normally I would be. So it wasn't a huge amount of time before I came off that as well. And we made a decision as a family to go about it in a different way and try and mediate it through things like diet and exercise. As we know, exercise is pretty good for mental health. Being in mental health and neurological disorder, 2 and 2 together, great. Throw Kieran at football. So and then sports just been that post for me, that pillar and rock thereafter, and I haven't been medicated since 2013.
Exercising, dieting, those two are key. And I know, Higgsy, you're one of them that loves exercise and dieting. For us, and understanding the effect of medication and that it's not the same for everybody is quite key, I think.
Don't get me wrong, I didn't have a great journey with it. Others have had a phenomenal response to medication. So there are, as there is with ADHD, the medication side of it and its effects, there's a spectrum. And so I was just at one end of it. I've heard of people that are having an amazing time on medications such as Elvance, for instance, which is something more recently been more recently available. It's actually one I'd quite like to try. So I've been talking to my GP around exploring new medications, and now that's been a whole new challenge in itself. But I'm quite keen to try something now to see what the advancements in our understanding of ADHD and therefore the medications available for it are, and how that might help or affect me in my life today, because obviously my life today was very different to my life then.
Yeah, I think it's quite cool that you're still kind of open to like trying different things, because I think the whole point around it being quite an individual thing and what works for you is kind of linked to like mental health as well. Because I know for me, back in the day, I tried medication, didn't work for me, started exercising, and that completely transformed my life. And I think it's really important to kind of assess it on a like person to person basis rather than just you've all got to take this and you'll be all right, because it's not the case really, is it?
No, absolutely. And where my thing is really, like I said earlier, exercise for me and sport for me, even to the extent of the competition side of it, I'm extremely competitive in everything I do. It has its own positives and negatives, right? But for me, if I don't exercise, if I'm not competing or if I'm not involved in some degree of sport, I see negative impact in nearly every other area of my life. So for me, I have to move. I have to be pushing myself physically, have to be exercising, to have that kind of that sweet spot across the board and everything else.
Thank you, Kieran, for sharing your personal journey with ADHD. I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be able to relate to this. Let's talk about your workplace journey. So in terms of your workplace journey, do you feel like your ADHD has allowed you to excel at work, or do you have any examples of this?
Cool, it's been a bit of a journey with work, to be honest. So I think I said earlier that I didn't really talk about it, although it may have been obvious to some people. I didn't really come out about it openly until 2018. I worked in motorsport for the majority of my adult life and some of my childhood too. And to your point, I think I excelled in motorsport because ADHD allowed me to hyper focus on key things in quite a chaotic, sometimes chaotic environment. So it allowed me to hone in on things. And as well, that kind of the variety that motorsport gave me as well actually helped my ADHD. I was able to adapt to my environment quite quickly, and I think that helped excel my career, really, having ADHD. Although like I say, I didn't share it until 2018. So I think it was 2017 when I went to Formula One, and so I joined the Williams Formula One team in 2017, where I was working in the wind tunnel on aerodynamic development, looking after kind of the technical aspect of the scale model during tunnel sessions. And I was in that environment for 12 hours a day, kind of sat in the seat in the office and then going into the tunnel section to make changes to the model. And I purposefully didn't share my ADHD in my interview process, because the first thing I thought of sharing ADHD with someone is that they were going to think, oh, he's hyperactive, he's not going to be able to sit still. This job requires extreme focus, and someone to sit still and focus on this model for the best part of 12 hours a day, right? So I thought that I may not get the job because I have ADHD. So I didn't tell them, but in fact, actually, some of the traits and things that I am challenged and blessed with, I'd like to say, actually really helped me in that environment. I really I believe in doing things that you enjoy, and I really enjoyed my job. So having ADHD and hyperfixation allowed me to hyper-focus on the things that I was doing, and excel during those 12-hour sessions, where someone that didn't really understand ADHD would think that I'd act quite the opposite. After that time, though, so when I came out of motorsport, was late 2018, joined a neuroscience startup called Smart Start Minds on the outskirts of London towards Essex. And then that's where I then started to feel at home, and I became really open about my ADHD. So I did an evening talk there for some parents one evening, alongside the CEO and neuroscientist that founded the business, and just felt at home. And then since I came out about that in that environment, I've felt super comfortable with it ever since. And I think being able to be open about my journey, reflect on it, and share it with others now has actually then continued to help me in the workplace, because I'm not masking anything. I'm able to be who I am, and I'm more confident in being that person. And the more I've come out about it, and the more I've shared about my journey, it's really interesting, I think, because the more feedback I've had from people, actually even colleagues recently, oh, you've made it normal. You've made it okay. You've made it normal to have ADHD and to talk to others about it. It's not something that we need to hide behind anymore. I did a webinar kind of this time last year during the Gen O program, so the talent acquisition program at Oracle, with the neurodiversity lead at the time, and a colleague of mine came out on that call about their own ADHD journey, and they'd never shared it with anyone before, and I thought that was super powerful. So yeah, I think it has its pros and its cons. It doesn't come without its challenges, but I'd like to think that it helps me at work more than hinders me. And the more I've come to understand it, the more I've been able to use it for more positive action than negative.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point around kind of the more you share about it, the more it becomes like a normal thing. And I think you probably help a lot more people by sharing your experiences than you actually think. I guess it's good to talk about how it allows you to excel at work, but have you ever felt your ADHD has been a bit of a hindrance at work? Because I know for me with dyslexia, I struggle with certain aspects in the corporate world. For example, with presentations and trying to remember all the information that you want to get across. I was just wondering if you had anything that is kind of a standout for you that is a challenge.
I wonder if some colleagues I've worked with in recent months are listening to this. They're probably sat there going, yes, it has affected him in the workplace. Now, it's interesting what you say about dyslexia and having challenges. And yes, the answer is yes, I've had some myself. So I think with some of the traits that I'm more challenged with, and I actually, although there's in some instances or some environments they may be perceived as negative, I actually like to think that for myself and the way that I like to work, I'm able to use them as a strength and a positive in certain situations, although that might not be perceived to be the case with other people that I might be working with. For example, if I leave things to the last minute, I can do really good work last minute and get it all done, knock it out the park. And what I sometimes struggle with is long lead times to things where in the corporate world, we know it moves quite slowly at times. And I really struggle with that. So if you've got things of actions that are agreed to take weeks, months, I find it hard to concentrate in that environment and get those done. Just get them done early, like most people would. They go, oh, okay, well, we've got this task now. We've got 3 months to do it. But if I get it done this week, I can focus on other things. My brain doesn't work like that. I'd love to be like that because I think in some instances it'd be far less stressful to work in that way. But I will leave it to week, few days before and get it done. But I think the self-awareness in me and knowing that that's the case allows me to use it as a strength as opposed to delivering late on anything.
I'm quite similar to you, Kieran, as well. And I just wanted to take it back to your point about sharing your story and your journey. You're raising awareness, but you're also building allies, and allyship is quite important in this day and age. What do you think?
I think allyship is extremely important because I think some of the stats that came out recently I saw from, I think it was Neurodiversity in Business, the charity that Dan Harris leads, said that it's estimated that around 20% of your workforce will be neurodiverse, which means there's 80% of people out there that may or may not understand what we're going through, how to get the best out of us. And the more that we kind of create that awareness, confident in ourselves and sharing it with people, the more we can help those people understand and convert those people into allies that can only further spread that awareness as far as we possibly can.
100%. And also, you mentioned earlier about autism. What has been your journey? Tell us more about your journey with autism.
Autism's been an interesting one. I've got a fair few friends and with autism, that have autism. Over the last few months, maybe a year or so, I've been just looking at things online and I tick too many boxes to not explore it. And it wasn't until I actually started volunteering for a neurodiversity charity, it was actually Neurodiversity in Business, where I just got talking to some of the other volunteers in the group as I was looking to get a re-diagnosis for ADHD, start to explore advancements in medication again. After some of the challenges that I'd had before, I like to think that the medical industry has kind of moved on somewhat in the last 15 years, and I'd like to try it again to see if there's some benefits to be had from that. And got talking to a few people. They said, "Have you thought about autism?" And I was like, "I've been thinking about it, but haven't taken it too seriously just yet." And I started to go down the rabbit hole with that. And the more I've gone down the rabbit hole, the more obvious it's become. And actually, interestingly, I've seen more and more cases of comorbidity. So people having ADHD or dyslexia or another neurodiverse condition and autism and something else. And that I don't think when I was originally diagnosed with ADHD, because autism wouldn't have just come about, right? We're generally born with these things. So when I was diagnosed, it wouldn't have been there. I don't think it would have been their first port of call to start checking for other things, especially if it wasn't externally obvious to start going down that rabbit hole. So I'm started exploring that now, but the journey to get there is on the NHS at the moment, and I feel for the NHS because they're strained at the best of times. But I think especially with neurodiversity, it's just a ridiculous pathway at the moment. So having a look at both NHS and private options, if you like.
And in terms of, tying this back into the workplace, have you seen people that are going through the journey to diagnosis?
Yeah, more and more actually. And especially people that are a little bit later in life, which I think has been really interesting. And I've had conversations with quite a few people now where they've spoken about how they're going on this journey and then they're reflecting back throughout their life and thought how obvious this has actually been for many years. But when they were a child, the awareness just wasn't there for either parents, family, friends, or medical professionals to pick up on it and kind of label it, if you like. And I hate that word label, but Can't really think of another way to explain it right now. And a few of them are going down the medication route. Some of them are just going through the holistic route of just becoming more self-aware about themselves, learning more about themselves, learning how to get the best out of themselves. And then some of those, and then another fraction of that group, then being open about sharing it in the workplace, whether it's with colleagues, managers, or whatnot, to then get the support to help them continue to excel in their career. But I think if you can see it all over LinkedIn, for instance, or online in general, that it's seeing more and more people in their adult years becoming diagnosed with a neurodiverse condition.
Yeah, I think I've seen that quite a lot as well. But I think there's also the argument of, oh, if you've gone your whole life without knowing, is there really kind of any point in finding out now? What do you think about that?
I think, in all honesty, and being blunt about it, I think it's extremely naive. Because just what if that period of time in your life, unknowingly, you've actually suffered with something, it's been more negative than positive, and you have an opportunity now to turn that table. I think people should embrace it, and really go down that journey of self-exploration. And then I think the art of reflection is powerful, right? And it's something I don't do enough of. But since going down the autism, going on that autism journey for me, I've started to reflect throughout my life, and then it's actually become more and more obvious. And I've gone, right, okay, well, I could have done this differently. I could have done that differently. When people are saying, oh, well, I've gone 30 years with it, and it's not just neurodiversity, right? People say this about all sorts of different things in life. I think it's almost like an easy way out for people, if I'm completely honest, and people shouldn't take the easy route out. Challenge yourself about it, explore yourself. And you're not only helping yourself by getting support or putting mechanisms in place to help yourself, you're also helping those around you, and hopefully then improve the way that you can excel in every area of life. I don't think that people should kind of just slip it under a rock because they have been diagnosed later in life.
And also, Kieran, to that point, there's also a lot of stigma. People are worried about the stigma that's attached to it. And I think they're brave enough to go through that journey to diagnosis. Taking that first step is a brave thing to do. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, the first step's the hardest step. It's always is, and people say it for pretty much anything, right? Often the first step is the hardest step to take. So if you've already gone all the way through the journey to diagnosis, like that's the hardest part. And then actually being hit with that label, that diagnosis at the end of it, for a lot of people it's relief, but for some people that's also a challenge. But I think the challenge in getting there was the hardest part, and the more that we are open about these journeys and the outcomes and the impact of it, the more I think we can help other people as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think there's a key area around, like within the workplace, around applying for jobs and kind of that process. What's your experiences been like with that? Do you think recruiters need to kind of adapt the process for those with neurodiversities and ADHD in particular?
Absolutely. My thoughts of the majority of kind of HR processes, especially for the challenges that I have, or should we say the traits that I express the most, it's a pain in the arse applying for jobs. I find it really difficult. Not only from you've got pages and pages of documents to fill out. You're seeing it now a bit more nowadays. You're seeing a little bit more automation included, like I'll upload your LinkedIn profile to this resume. Interestingly, in half of those instances, you still then have to go and fill out a load of other information. So for someone to really just screen that to say yes or no to an interview, do we really need to go to that depth at stage one? I think for people with neurodiverse conditions, it's that really your personality and a lot of the skills that show that you can do the job come out in the stages of the interviews. That's where I believe I excel, is not what's written on the paper. It's once I get in the room and I'm able to speak to people, and nowadays be open about my journey, and share some of the work that I've done with that. So for instance, speaking on stage at the Farnborough Air Show, to the Aerospace Global Forum, about my journey with ADHD, the webinars that we've done internally, some of the stuff that I've done externally with charities and such like. And I think it's those things that you can't really get across without writing 5 pages of a CV, which no one's really going to read. I think also from a technology's perspective is that these portals that we go through to apply for these jobs aren't neuro-inclusive enough. I think there's a lot of advancements that could be made by most technology companies to become more neuro-inclusive, to streamline that talent acquisition process and we've got so many companies now shouting about how they're trying to hire in diverse talent, yet they're doing it using the same old processes, the same wording. I'm seeing some people, and there is a lot of businesses are starting to progress down in line with that and starting to change their wording on job descriptions to become more inclusive. But I think that there's still a long way to go. My journey through the corporate, startup and corporate world, I've gone to apply for jobs and not finished I've got bored halfway through the application process, and not applied for it. I may have got that role. I may have been an asset to that business or team that I was applying to be in, but the route to getting there just wasn't supportive for what I needed.
Thank you for sharing that, Kieran. And I agree with you. I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a one-off destination. It's a continuous, ongoing journey where you learn and you adapt. What advice would you give to parents who have children with ADHD and are going through that early journey?
It's a really good question and a really difficult one to answer, because I think what we need to remember, especially with neurodiversity, is it's a spectrum, right? So your advice to one set of parents may be an absolute nightmare, or not even tenable for another community of parents. So I guess I'd like to think, with kind of how I've come out the other end, and I'm still very much on a journey myself. I'm very much very passionate about self-development. I think I'd like to think that I've made somewhat of a success out of my journey so far. I've got high ambitions. I've got a long way to go, like I say, but to those kind of walking a similar path as when I was a kid, to those parents, it can and most likely will be okay. I think parents nowadays, compared to when my mother was going through that journey, where she was being blamed for my behavior through bad parenting, which was completely not her fault. It was the ADHD, right? My mum was incredible in raising me, but she'd go into school meetings being blamed for everything. I don't necessarily think we're still entirely in that world anymore. I think schools are becoming more aware of the differences, and aren't quite so blameful in those situations. But for those that feel that they're on a bit of a challenging journey early on in life, I think there's a lot more support out there. So I'd encourage people to go and get support, especially charities like Parenting Special Children, for instance, in Berkshire. Recently had a few meetings with them, incredible charity. But there is a lot of help out there that wasn't there when I was a child. And I'd say first of all, seek that help. And don't feel embarrassed to share where you're at. I think there's credibility and confidence to be had in being vulnerable, and that you're not the only one. There is a lot of people going down the same path, probably with very, very similar experiences to yourself. And it's just finding that community of people where you can find a place of belonging and support, really.
Yeah, I think for me as well, when I got my diagnosis with dyslexia being severe as well, my dad, I think he just felt so bad that he didn't identify it, or he couldn't tell that something was wrong during school. But actually it's not the parents it's not on them to kind of think about these things, I guess. I think it's researching and educating yourself around these things can help you, like parents, to identify if that is the case with their child. I think that's a really important aspect as well.
Absolutely. And I think a key thing with that as well is that let's remember that when our parents were children, or as our parents were growing up and they had us, they were in a world where this wasn't very well understood. So this is new to them as well. And I think we need to be kind to, we need to be we need to be kind to that fact, and support our parents in it as much as we need support from them, because, like I say, a lot of these diagnoses weren't around when we were younger. I think if we look at the way I was diagnosed versus diagnosis now, that's changed a lot, right? But I've got friends that are say 10 or 15 years older than me that were just labeled problem children, because there wasn't a process to diagnosis back then, and that's our parents' era. So yeah, we're gonna just kind of got to be kind. We're all there. Parents and children are going on a journey together.
I just want to take the opportunity to give a shout out to your mum. What's her name?
Michelle.
Michelle, you're an amazing woman, you know. From what Kieran has said, you've gone through a lot and you've shown bravery. And here he is now. So thank you, Michelle.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
So we like to end our episodes on asking this question to our guests. If you could give one key takeaway from this episode to our audience, what would it be?
Cool. A key takeaway. I'd love for if one person listens to this and they can relate to it and they can smile by the end of it. I think that'd be amazing. But my key takeaway really is really for your guys' inclusivity of neurodiversity, and go, okay, do you know what, let's get Kieran on to talk about ADHD and support that raising of awareness. So the biggest takeaway from me is what you guys are really doing with the podcast, to raise that awareness across D&I, and help that wider community become more confident, and also then support the businesses, hopefully some businesses that are listening, in changing their processes to become more inclusive, to build these diverse teams that we're hearing a lot about, and also to create allyship. I think we need to raise awareness using platforms such as this, to raise that awareness, and convert people into allies.
Thank you, Kieran. That's making me quite emotional thinking about when me and Georgie started the podcast. But no, thank you for being with us today. And that's all for today's episode on ADHD with our amazing guest, Kieran, and where we discuss his personal journey, but also how ADHD affects in the workplace.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, Kieran, for coming and speaking so openly about your experiences. You've given such great insight with a lot of information that the audience can take away with them. And thank you to our listeners for joining us this week. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we have. Please make sure to follow the podcast on Spotify, and also giving it a rating and review too if you feel like it.
So our next episode will be dropping shortly. So keep your eyes peeled for our next guest. And thank you again for listening. And we'll see you next time on Diversity and Inclusion, Satisfying the Tick Box.